Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Mr. Chill Chapter. Tonight, we'll be sharing 9 haunted road trip stories from Texas highways. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another night of chilling tales. Now, let's begin.
Story 1. The phantom truck that chased me outside Marfa. My name is Clint Morgan. I'm 48 years old, and for the last 25 of those years, I've been a long-haul trucker. I've seen this country through the panoramic view of a Freightliner windshield, from the sun-drenched coasts of California to the frozen backwoods of Maine. I've driven through blizzards that bury the road in a blanket of white, through thunderstorms that turn the sky black at noon, and through fog so thick you feel like you're swimming through milk. I'm not a man who spooks easily. The road is my home, and after a quarter century, you think you've seen everything it has to throw at you. You learn its rhythms, its moods, its tricks. You learn to read the signs, the way the air feels before a storm, the way the animals behave, the subtle hum of the tires on different kinds of asphalt. But nothing, absolutely nothing in all my years and all my miles prepared me for what happened on that stretch of US 90 just outside Marfa, Texas. It was a Tuesday night in late October. The air had that crisp, dry bite to it that you only get in the high desert after the sun goes down. I was hauling a load of machine parts from El Paso to San Antonio, a run I'd made 100 times before. It's a lonely drive. Once you're past Van Horn, the world just opens up into this vast, empty darkness. It's you, the ribbon of asphalt illuminated by your headlights, and a universe of stars so bright they look like spilled salt on black velvet. It's a beautiful, humbling kind of loneliness, the kind that makes you feel small but also connected to everything. I was feeling good. The cab was warm. The low growl of my Cummins engine was a familiar comfort, and I had a thermos of black coffee that was still hot. I was making good time, pushing just a little over the speed limit because there was no one else out there. The radio was playing some old country station, the signal crackling in and out, a ghostly voice singing about heartbreak and dusty roads. It was around 2 a.m. My eyes were getting a little heavy, that familiar late-night burn starting to set in, but I was focused. You have to be. Out there, your focus is the only thing between you and oblivion. That's when I first saw it. A flicker in my driver's side mirror, a single point of light far behind me. It's not unusual to see another truck on that route, even at that hour. We're the night crawlers, the ones who keep the country moving while everyone else is asleep. I didn't think much of it. I took a sip of coffee, my eyes scanning the road ahead, then my mirrors again, a routine as ingrained as breathing. The light was closer now, much closer, and it was gaining on me fast. There was something odd about it, though. It was a single headlight, a sickly yellow-white like an old incandescent bulb. Modern rigs have powerful bright white LEDs. This looked old, and it was bobbing and weaving slightly, not like a drunk driver, but like it was mounted on something with a rough, jarring suspension. I squinted into the mirror. The light was so bright it was hard to make out the shape behind it, but it was big. Definitely a truck. And it was coming up on me with a speed that was just reckless. I was doing 70, and this thing was closing the gap like I was standing still. "All right, cowboy, what's your hurry?" I muttered to myself, easing my foot off the accelerator a bit to let him pass. It's an unwritten rule of the road. If someone's in that much of a rush, you give them space. You don't know their story. Maybe it's a medical emergency, maybe they're just a fool high on adrenaline. Either way, you let them go. But he didn't pass. The truck pulled up right behind me, so close that its single glaring eye filled my entire mirror, blinding me. It was tailgating me with a terrifying aggression. I could feel the heat of its engine, or maybe I was just imagining it. My knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. This wasn't normal. This was a challenge, a threat. I flashed my brake lights twice, the universal signal for back off. The truck didn't budge. If anything, it felt like it got closer. The light so intense it was like a physical pressure against my rig. My heart started to pound, a heavy, frantic drum against my ribs. The coffee in my stomach turned sour. This was wrong. All my senses, honed by years on the road, were screaming at me that this was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I decided to get a better look. I leaned over, trying to see it in my passenger side mirror, hoping to get a different angle, to see the cab, the driver, anything. What I saw made the blood in my veins run cold. The passenger mirror showed me the same thing, a single blinding headlight. It was impossible. From that angle, I should have been able to see the rest of the truck's front grille, the other side of the cab. But there was nothing. Just that one light hanging in the darkness, as if the rest of the truck didn't exist in that dimension. It was like looking at a cyclops. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping vine wrapping around my chest. I sped up. 75, 80. The Peterbilt I was driving was powerful, but it was hauling 40,000 pounds of steel. It wasn't built for speed. The truck behind me matched my acceleration effortlessly, its light staying locked in my mirror, a malevolent, unblinking eye. It was toying with me. Then it pulled out into the oncoming lane to overtake me. I felt a surge of relief. Finally. Let this lunatic get ahead of me and disappear into the night. As it drew alongside my cab, I turned my head to look, ready to lay on my horn and give the driver a piece of my mind. I will never forget what I saw, and what I didn't see. The truck was a ghost from another era. It was a long-nosed Peterbilt, maybe a 50s or 60s model, but it was a wreck. The body was covered in rust, not the surface kind, but deep, cancerous rust that looked like it was eating the metal from the inside out. Dents and gashes scarred its sides, telling a story of 1,000 violent encounters. The chrome was pitted and black. The windows were so grimy they were opaque, and a thick, dark smoke smelling of sulfur and burnt oil billowed from its exhaust stacks. But that wasn't the scariest part. The scariest part was the cab. It was empty. There was no driver, no silhouette, no shadowy figure, nothing. The steering wheel was visible, stark and still under the faint glow of my own running lights. The driver's seat was a gaping void. My mind refused to process it. A driverless truck moving at over 80 miles an hour, chasing me down a deserted highway in the middle of the Texas desert. My breath hitched in my throat. I was looking at a phantom, a ghost rig. As it pulled ahead of me, it swerved suddenly, cutting me off. I slammed on my brakes, the air brakes hissing in protest, the massive weight of my cargo pushing me forward. My trailer jackknifed, the back end swinging out into the other lane with a terrifying screech of tortured rubber. I fought the wheel, my arms straining, my whole body screaming with adrenaline. I managed to get the rig back under control, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. I had come within inches of rolling my truck and ending my life on that empty stretch of asphalt. The phantom truck was now in front of me, slowing down, forcing me to slow down with it. It was boxing me in. This wasn't random, this was predatory, it was hunting me. Then its brake lights flickered on. They were dim like dying embers, and they were shaped like skulls. I'm not making that up. Tiny grinning skulls that glowed a faint blood red. The truck slowed to a crawl, then to a stop, blocking the entire road. I had no choice but to stop behind it, my headlights illuminating its decaying form. The air grew still. The only sound was the idling of my own engine and the frantic thumping of my own heart. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, a standoff in the heart of the void. The smoke from its stacks was so thick now it was like a black fog obscuring the stars. The smell was overpowering, a nauseating mix of diesel and something else. something rotten. And then I heard it, a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. It started as a low rumble, and then it grew into a deafening blast. It was the truck's horn, but it wasn't the sound of a normal air horn. It was a discordant metallic shriek that sounded like a chorus of tortured souls. It was a scream, a mechanical, soulless scream that vibrated through my cab, through my seat, through my very bones. It was a sound of pure malice and agony. That scream broke me. The last vestiges of logic and reason evaporated. I was no longer a professional trucker. I was prey. My survival instincts took over. I wrenched the steering wheel to the right, pulling my rig off the asphalt and onto the rough sandy shoulder of the desert. I didn't care about the tires, the suspension, nothing. I just had to get away. I floored it, my truck bouncing and groaning as it tore through the desert scrub. I looked in my mirror. The phantom truck was turning, its single headlight swinging around to follow me. It drove off the road too, its ancient chassis rattling as it bounced over the uneven terrain, never losing speed. It was coming for me. The chase was a nightmare. I was weaving through cacti and rocks, my headlights cutting a frantic path through the darkness. The phantom truck was right behind me, its horrifying horn scream splitting the night. It was gaining. I could see the rust on its grille in my rearview mirror. I could almost feel the chill coming off it. I saw the faint glow of lights on the horizon. A town, Marfa. It couldn't have been more than a few miles away. Hope surged through me, a desperate, powerful wave. I aimed my truck for the lights and prayed. I pushed the engine harder than I ever had before, the temperature gauge climbing into the red. The scream of the phantom truck was right behind my ear. I braced for impact, convinced it was going to ram me from behind, sending me flipping into the darkness. But as I got closer to the town limits, as the first few streetlights came into view, the screaming stopped. I risked a glance in the mirror. The truck was falling back. Its single headlight seemed to be dimming, fading into the oppressive darkness of the desert it came from. I kept my foot pressed to the floor, not daring to believe it. I hit the edge of town, the asphalt smooth under my tires again, and I didn't slow down. I blew through the first stop sign, my rig rattling and shaking. I finally pulled over at a brightly lit 24-hour gas station on the main street. I stumbled out of my cab, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. I leaned against the side of my truck, gasping for air, my body drenched in a cold sweat. I looked back down the highway, back into the blackness. There was nothing there, just the empty road, the silent desert, and the star-filled sky. It was gone. I did a walk-around of my rig. The tires were shredded, the paint on the sides was scratched and scraped from the desert brush. But there was no other damage, no sign of impact. It was as if the phantom truck had been made of smoke and noise. I've been driving for 25 years. I'm a rational man. But I can't explain what happened that night. I've tried. I've told myself I was overtired, that I was hallucinating, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I can't explain the shredded tires. I can't explain the feeling of pure, intelligent malice that came off that thing. And I can't get that sound, that terrible, soul-tearing scream out of my head. I don't take that route anymore. I'll drive 100 miles out of my way to avoid it, because I know what I saw. The road is my home, but there are things out there in the lonely places, in the deep, dark heart of the night that are older and stranger than any of us can imagine. And if you're lucky, they'll just let you pass. I wasn't lucky that night. I was hunted, and I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that the phantom truck is still out there, patrolling the abandoned highways, waiting for another driver to appear in its mirror. Did you enjoy this story? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video. And now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2, The Hitchhiker on Route 66, who faded into dust. My name is Rachel Vega. I'm a photographer, 31 years old, and I've always been drawn to the places that time forgot. I find beauty in decay, in the peeling paint of an old barn, the rust on a forgotten car, the way nature reclaims what man has built. My work is a kind of modern archaeology, I suppose. I document the ghosts of the American landscape, and there is no place more famously haunted by its own past than Route 66. They call it the Mother Road, the Main Street of America. But the parts of it that still exist, especially the stretches that cut through the Texas Panhandle, are more like a graveyard. The interstate bypassed it decades ago, and what's left is a collection of ghost towns, abandoned motels with empty swimming pools and gas stations with pumps frozen on a price from a bygone era. It's a photographer's dream, a sad, beautiful, and deeply eerie dream. Last spring, I decided to spend a week driving the Texas portion of the route, from Shamrock to Adrian, the midway point. My project was titled Ghosts of 66, and my goal was to capture the palpable sense of loss and memory that hangs in the air out there. I wanted to photograph the ruins not just as abandoned buildings, but as monuments to the millions of dreams that had traveled that road, some fulfilled, many broken. I had my Canon, a bag full of lenses, a cooler of water, and a playlist of old blues and folk music. I was in my element. The first few days were incredible. I shot crumbling motor courts near McLean, the iconic and leaning water tower in Groom, and the bizarrely beautiful Cadillac Ranch outside Amarillo. The landscape is vast and humbling, the sky so big it feels like a physical presence, but there's a loneliness to it that seeps into you. You can drive for an hour and not see another car. The silence is broken only by the wind, a constant, mournful sigh that whispers through the tall, dry grass. It was on my fourth day, somewhere west of Amarillo, that the project took a turn from metaphorical ghosts to something terrifyingly literal. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. It was the golden hour, a perfect time for photography. The light was soft and warm, making the desolate landscape look almost romantic. I was driving slowly, my window down, the warm air rushing in, looking for the next shot. And then I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder of the road, his thumb half-heartedly stuck out. A hitchhiker. You just don't see that anymore, not really. Especially not out here in the middle of nowhere with the next town miles away and dusk settling in. My first instinct was one of caution. My dad's voice echoed in my head from 1,000 lectures. Never pick up hitchhikers, Rachel. But as I got closer, my apprehension turned to a strange kind of pity, mixed with a photographer's curiosity. He didn't look dangerous, he looked lost. Lost in time. He was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, with a lean frame. He was wearing clothes that seemed out of place for the modern era. He had on a pair of dusty, worn-out dungarees, a simple white t-shirt that had seen better days, and a flat cap pulled low over his brow. He wasn't carrying a backpack or a suitcase, just his own 2 hands shoved deep into his pockets. His face was what really got me. It was thin and etched with a weariness that seemed far too profound for someone so young. But his eyes were dark and incredibly sad, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked like a character straight out of a Steinbeck novel, a Dust Bowl migrant heading west with nothing but hope and desperation. He was the living embodiment of the very ghosts I had come here to photograph. The artist in me screamed, "You have to talk to him, you have to take his portrait." The rational part of me was still screaming, "Drive away." For better or for worse, the artist won. I slowed my Jeep to a stop about 20 feet past him. I watched him in my rearview mirror. He didn't run up to the car, eager for a ride. He just stood there, watching me, as if waiting to see what I would do. I put the car in reverse and backed up slowly until my passenger window was level with him. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound casual, friendly. He looked at me, and for a moment he didn't say anything. He just stared with those hauntingly sad eyes. The setting sun cast a long shadow behind him, making him look tall and spectral. The wind picked up, rustling the grass around his feet. Finally, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Where are you headed?" I asked. He spoke for the first time, his voice raspy and quiet, like a dry leaf skittering across pavement. "West," he said. Just that one word. "Well, I'm going west," I replied with a smile. "Hop in." He walked around to the passenger side and opened the back door, not the front. I found that a little odd, but I didn't question it. He slid into the back seat right behind me and closed the door with a soft click. The car suddenly felt colder. I chalked it up to the evening air and the sun disappearing below the horizon. I pulled back onto the empty road. "My name's Rachel," I said, trying to break the heavy silence that had settled in the car. I waited for a response. Nothing. I glanced at the rearview mirror. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands on his knees, staring straight ahead, not at the scenery, but through it. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of the car's interior, but I could still see the profound sadness in his posture. "So, what's your story?" I tried again, feeling a little awkward. "You from around here?" He turned his head slightly and looked at me in the mirror. His eyes seemed to bore right through me. "Been on this road a long time," he whispered. His voice was so faint I could barely hear it over the sound of the engine. "I can imagine," I said, my photographer's brain kicking in again. "I'm actually out here documenting the old route. The history. You look like you could be part of that history. You mind if I ask you a few questions? Maybe even take your picture when we find a good spot." He didn't answer. He just turned his gaze back to the road ahead. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just awkward, it was heavy, oppressive. The air in the car grew thick and still, and the cold I'd felt earlier intensified, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. I shivered and turned up the heat, but it didn't seem to make a difference. A strange feeling began to creep over me. A primal sense of unease, the kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved a muscle. He was like a statue, a silent, sorrowful passenger from another world. The initial pity and curiosity I'd felt were rapidly being replaced by a growing dread. My dad's warnings were no longer a distant echo, they were a deafening siren in my mind. I decided I needed to end this encounter. "Look, the next town is Vega. I can drop you there," I said, my voice a little tighter than I intended. "You can probably find a place to stay for the night." Again silence. He gave no sign that he had heard me. My heart was starting to beat faster. The beautiful, lonely road no longer felt romantic. It felt menacing. The long shadows cast by the setting sun looked like grasping fingers. The wind howling outside sounded like a wail. I just wanted him out of my car. "You know," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "I'm actually pretty tired. I think I'm going to pull over in Vega myself. So that'll be the end of the line for me." I risked another look in the rearview mirror, ready to insist that he acknowledge me. The back seat was empty. Blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. I stared into the mirror, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. He was gone. It was impossible. I hadn't stopped the car. I hadn't heard a door open or close. He had been there just seconds ago, a solid physical presence. And now, there was nothing. My blood ran ice cold. A gasp escaped my lips and I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the old asphalt. The jeep fishtailed slightly before coming to a halt in the middle of the deserted highway. I whipped my head around, my eyes wide with terror, scanning the empty back seat. He wasn't there. But something was. On the black leather of the seat, right where he had been sitting, was a small, neat pile of fine, gray dust. It was shaped almost like a seated figure in miniature, a tiny, ephemeral monument to the man who had been there moments before. As I stared, a gust of wind from my still-open window swirled into the car and caught the pile. The dust lifted into the air, dancing in the last rays of sunlight for a brief, beautiful, terrifying moment, like a soul ascending. And then it was gone, dispersed into nothingness. I sat there, frozen, my hands locked on the steering wheel, my mind screaming. I couldn't breathe. The cold in the car was now an intense, bone-deep chill, the kind that feels ancient and unnatural. The silence was absolute. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear. It could have been seconds or minutes. But then a new wave of terror washed over me. The realization that I was alone in the dark, on a haunted road where people literally turned to dust. I didn't take the keys out of the ignition. I didn't even close my window. I stomped on the accelerator and the Jeep shot forward. I drove with a blind animal panic, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, too terrified to even glance in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if he was there again. I didn't want to see those sad, empty eyes looking back at me. I drove right through Vega without even noticing it. I drove until I saw the bright, reassuringly modern lights of a chain hotel in Amarillo. I checked in, my hands shaking so much I could barely sign my name. I locked myself in my room, turned on every light, and sat on the bed wrapped in a blanket until the sun came up. I packed my bags the next morning. I didn't go back out to Route 66. The project was over. The ghosts I had been looking for were no longer a metaphor. I had found one, or rather, he had found me. I can't look at the photos I took on that trip anymore. They're beautiful, but they're tainted by the memory of that encounter. I don't know who or what he was. A ghost? A memory trapped on that lonely stretch of road? A soul still trying to finish his journey west? All I know is that he was real. He sat in my car, and then he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a pile of dust and a cold that I can still feel sometimes late at night when the wind sounds a certain way. I went looking for the ghosts of the Mother Road, and I learned that some ghosts are not content to be photographed. Some of them want to ride. Story 3. The Vanishing Bridge over the Brazos. My name is Jerry Collins. I'm 52 and I've lived my whole life in Central Texas. I sell insurance for a living, a job that's all about calculating risks and probabilities. I deal in facts and figures, in the predictable patterns of life. On the weekends, though, I escape all that. My church is the river. I'm a fisherman, specifically a catfish fisherman. There's a peace that comes with being on the water, especially at night, that you can't find anywhere else. It's a world of quiet patience, of listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the hull of your boat, of watching the moon rise over the cypress trees. The Brazos River is my favorite spot. It's a big, moody river, ancient and powerful. It has its secrets, its hidden depths. I've spent hundreds of nights on that river, and I thought I knew it like the back of my hand. I knew every bend, every sandbar, every deep hole where the big blue cats like to hide. I respected the river the way you respect any force of nature that's bigger and older than you are. But I was never afraid of it. Not until that night last November. It had been a perfect evening for fishing. The air was cool and still, and a thick blanket of fog had started to roll in just after sunset, which is prime time for catfishing. The fog muffles the world, creating a sense of isolation that I usually find comforting. It's just you, your boat, and the river sealed off from everything else. I was in my small, flat-bottomed John boat, anchored in a little cove a few miles downstream from the usual public boat ramp. I'd had a good night pulling in a couple of decent-sized channel cats. Around midnight, I decided to call it a day. The fog had grown incredibly dense, thicker than I'd ever seen it. It was like a solid white wall. Visibility was down to maybe 10 feet. When I pulled up my anchor, I could barely see the front of my own boat. This should have been my first warning. The river is a different beast in fog that thick. Landmarks disappear. Your sense of direction gets twisted. But I had my GPS. In my world of calculated risks, technology was my safety net. I fired up the small outboard motor and started to head back upstream towards the boat ramp. The journey that usually took me 20 minutes was slow going. I had to keep my speed down, my eyes straining to pierce the impenetrable white soup. The familiar shapes of the riverbank, the gnarled roots of a fallen oak, the limestone bluff were completely gone, swallowed by the fog. The only thing I could see was the faint greenish glow of my GPS screen. I put my faith in the little blinking dot that was me and the blue line that was the river. After about 15 minutes of tense, slow navigation, I noticed something strange on the GPS. It was suggesting a new route. A dotted line appeared on the screen indicating a shortcut. It showed a small channel branching off the main river that seemed to cut a huge bend, rejoining the river much closer to the boat ramp. It would save me at least 10 minutes. I'd been fishing this stretch of the Brazos for 20 years, and I had never known there to be a channel there. I figured it must be a new feature on the GPS map, an update I hadn't noticed. Or maybe it was an old forgotten channel that was usually too shallow to navigate, but was passable now because the river was running high after recent rains. My mind, the logical insurance salesman's mind, found a plausible explanation. I was tired, I was cold. A shortcut sounded good. Against my better judgment, against the fisherman's intuition that was whispering in the back of my head, I trusted the technology. I turned my boat and followed the dotted line. The entrance to the channel was narrow, almost hidden by a curtain of hanging moss and cypress knees. As I entered, the fog seemed to get even thicker, if that was possible. The air grew heavy and smelled of damp earth and decay, a much stronger, more primal smell than the usual scent of the river. The sound of my motor seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space, but at the same time it felt like the sound was being absorbed by the fog, unable to travel more than a few feet. I checked my GPS again. The screen flickered. The satellite signal icon was blinking yellow. Weak signal. A knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. I was in a place I didn't recognize, in a fog that felt like a living thing, and my only guide was failing me. I thought about turning back, but when I looked behind me, the entrance to the channel was already gone, consumed by the white void. The only way was forward. I pushed on, the channel twisting and turning, and then, through a momentary thinning of the fog, I saw it. A bridge. It wasn't on my GPS, it wasn't on any map I had ever seen of this area. It was an old, rickety-looking structure, a single-lane bridge made of dark, weathered wood and rusted iron trusses. It looked ancient, like something out of the Civil War era. It was a vehicle bridge, not a footbridge, but it was so narrow and decrepit I couldn't imagine anyone driving a car over it. It stood there, spanning the channel, a dark, skeletal shape against the swirling gray. My first thought was, how do I get under it? It looked too low, but as I got closer, I saw that the channel didn't go under the bridge. The channel ended. The water just stopped at a muddy bank right before the bridge. My GPS was now showing my little blinking dot right at the base of a solid red line that represented a road. A road I had never heard of. According to the screen, the only way to continue the shortcut was to get on that road and cross that bridge. This was insane. I was in a boat. My truck and trailer were miles away at the boat ramp. The GPS had led me to a dead end. Frustration and anger warred with a growing sense of fear. I killed the motor, and the silence that descended was absolute and terrifying. It was a dead silence, not the living silence of the river I was used to, which was always filled with the hum of insects and the croak of frogs. Here, there was nothing. I sat there for a moment trying to think, trying to force my logical mind to find a solution. And then I heard a sound, a faint rhythmic creaking. Creak, crook, creak, crook. It was coming from the bridge. It sounded like the bridge was swaying, like it was bearing a heavy weight. But there was nothing on it. It was empty. The creaking grew louder, more insistent. It was joined by another sound, a low groaning like stressed wood and metal. It was the sound of the bridge itself, as if it were alive and in pain. The fog swirled around its timbers, making it appear and disappear. One moment it was a solid structure, the next it was a ghostly outline. I felt a deep, primal fear take root in my soul. This place was wrong. The silence, the smell, the impossible bridge, it was all wrong. My fisherman's intuition, the one I had ignored, was now screaming at me. Get out. Get out now. I fumbled for the pull cord on my motor, my hands shaking. I gave it a pull. Nothing. The engine sputtered and died. I pulled again, harder this time. A weak cough, then silence. I flooded it. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through me. I was stranded at the foot of a groaning phantom bridge in a fog that had swallowed the world. I looked up at the bridge again, and this time, I saw something. In the very center of the span, a shadow was forming. It was a dark, indistinct shape coalescing out of the fog. It was long and low. It looked like a car, an old-fashioned car, a black sedan from the 1930s or 40s. It was just sitting there, silent and dark, where there had been nothing but empty space seconds before. The creaking and groaning intensified, as if the bridge was straining under the sudden appearance of this new weight. I stared, mesmerized by the sheer impossibility of it. My mind was scrambling, trying to find a rational explanation. It was there all along, the fog was just hiding it. But I knew that wasn't true. I had been staring at that spot. It had been empty. Then one of the car's headlights flickered on, a single dim yellow light like a dying candle. It cut a weak beam through the fog, and in that faint illumination I saw a figure in the driver's seat, a silhouette, a man in a hat, his head tilted down as if he were looking at the floorboards. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought they would break. I was no longer just lost. I was in the presence of something otherworldly, something that operated by rules I didn't understand. The figure in the car lifted its head slowly and turned to look directly at me. I couldn't see a face, just the dark shape of a head turning in the gloom. But I felt its gaze. It was a feeling of immense sorrow and a terrifying, bottomless despair. It was a look that said, "You're trapped here too." That was it. That was the breaking point. Adrenaline, pure and potent, flooded my system. I didn't care about the boat anymore. I didn't care about my fishing gear. I had to get away from that bridge. I scrambled to the back of the boat, my feet slipping on the damp floor. I plunged into the cold, murky water of the channel. The shock of the cold was immense, but the fear was greater. I started swimming, not back the way I came, but away from the bridge, towards the riverbank, thrashing through the water in a blind panic. I didn't look back. I was terrified that if I did, I would see the figure from the car standing on the bank waiting for me. I clawed my way up the muddy bank, my clothes heavy with water, my body shaking from cold and terror. I was in a thicket of trees and thorns. I just ran. I ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing at my clothes and skin. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from the river, away from that impossible groaning bridge. I must have run for a mile, maybe more. I finally stumbled out of the woods and onto a paved road. I recognized it. It was the main road that led to the boat ramp. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, my body screaming with pain and exhaustion. I was soaked, muddy, and bleeding from a dozen scratches, but I was alive. And I was back in the world I knew. I walked the rest of the way to the boat ramp, which was another 2 miles down the road. My truck and empty trailer were sitting there just as I'd left them. The fog was starting to lift. The world was returning to normal. The next weekend, I couldn't stay away. I had to know. I went back to that stretch of the river, this time in broad daylight. I took my boat and I searched for hours. There is no channel. There is no shortcut. The riverbank is a solid, unbroken line of mud and trees, exactly as I've always known it to be. There is no road, and there is no bridge. There is no sign that one ever existed. I sell insurance. I deal in the tangible, the predictable, but I know what I saw. My GPS led me down a river that doesn't exist, to a bridge that was never built, where a ghost from a forgotten time is still waiting in his car. I trespassed into a place where the past hasn't faded away. It's just waiting in the fog for the next lost traveler. I don't fish that part of the river at night anymore. I don't fish in the fog at all, and I will never ever trust a shortcut again. Of course, we will now delve deeper into the darkness, continuing our journey down the haunted highways of Texas. The following accounts are transcribed as they were told, capturing the raw, visceral fear of the narrators. These are stories of isolation, of impossible realities, and of the terrifying moments when the veil between worlds grows thin. Here are the next 3 stories, each a detailed first-person testament to the horrors that wait in the lonely places. Story 4. The Ghostly Lights of the Big Bend Backroads. My name is Angela Ruiz. I'm 34 and I work as a graphic designer in Austin. My life is pixels and deadlines, CMYK and RGB. A world confined to a 27-inch screen. To balance that, I've always been a chaser of wide-open spaces. I'm a hiker, a camper, an amateur astronomer, anything that gets me away from the city glow and under a canopy of stars. For me, the ultimate escape has always been Big Bend National Park. Big Bend isn't just a park, it's another planet. It's a place of stark, brutal beauty where the Chisos Mountains rise like jagged purple islands from a sea of desert. The silence out there is a physical thing. It has weight. It presses in on you, forcing you to listen to the beat of your own heart. And the night sky. God, the night sky is the reason I fell in love with the place. It's one of the darkest spots in North America. The Milky Way isn't a faint smudge. It's a brilliant, shimmering river of light, so clear you feel like you could reach out and touch it. Last year, I planned a solo trip for the week of the Perseid meteor shower. The idea of watching shooting stars in that pristine darkness was my definition of heaven. I spent a couple of days hiking the Window Trail and lost mine, letting the desert sun bake the city stress out of me. On the 3rd night, the peak of the shower, I decided to do something a little different. I'd heard, of course, about the Marfa lights, the famous mystery lights that dance on the horizon northwest of the park. I'd seen them once before from the official viewing area on US 90, distant, intriguing, but ultimately remote. That night, a fellow camper, an old-timer with a leather-brown face and a twinkle in his eye, told me about a spot. "You want to see the real lights," he'd said, tracing a line on my dusty map with his finger. "Not the tourist show. There are back roads, old ranch roads east of Terlingua. The lights come closer there. They say the mountains have a different energy." His directions were vague, a mix of turn left at the 3 big yuccas and follow the dry creek bed till it forks. It sounded like an adventure. My logical side knew it was a bad idea to go exploring unpaved, unmarked roads in the desert at night, alone. But the romantic, adventurous side, the one that brought me out here in the first place, was captivated. See the real lights, up close. So after sunset, I packed a thermos of tea, my camera gear, and my telescope into my Subaru. I drove out of the park and through the ghost town of Terlingua, the last outpost of civilization. Following the old man's dubious directions, I turned off the main paved road onto a dirt track that was little more than 2 tire ruts in the sand. My headlights cut a lonely tunnel through the pitch-black desert. The world outside my car was an impenetrable wall of darkness, punctuated by the ghostly shapes of cacti and ocotillo. For about 30 minutes, it was magical. I had my windows down. The cool desert air smelled of creosote and dust, and the sky above was putting on its show. Meteors streaked across the cosmos, silent, fleeting scratches of light. I felt completely, utterly alone in the best possible way. A tiny, insignificant spectator to a cosmic ballet. I was so focused on the sky that I almost missed the fork in the road. The old man had said to take the right fork. I did. The road immediately got worse. It was rockier, narrower, and seemed to be climbing into a series of low, rolling hills. My Subaru handled it, but it was slow going. I started to feel a little knot of unease. The initial thrill of adventure was being replaced by the practical concern of getting a flat tire, or worse, getting lost. That's when I saw the first light. It wasn't a meteor. This was different. It wasn't in the sky. It was low to the ground, maybe 100 yards to my left, hovering over a patch of prickly pear cacti. It was a single orb of light, about the size of a basketball, glowing with a soft, pulsating blue-white luminescence. It was beautiful. Wow, I whispered to myself, slowing the car to a stop. I thought maybe it was another car's headlight reflecting off something, but the light was self-contained. It wasn't casting a beam. The light emanated from within it. I grabbed my camera, my hands fumbling with the lens cap, my heart pounding with the excitement of a wildlife photographer who's just spotted a rare snow leopard. This was it, the real lights. I got the camera up to my eye, but as I tried to focus, the orb zipped to the right with impossible speed, covering 50 yards in a split second with no sound whatsoever. It stopped abruptly and just hovered again. My jaw dropped. This wasn't a reflection. This wasn't a drone. It moved with a speed and precision that defied physics. The orb seemed to be aware of me. It began to move again, this time paralleling the road ahead of me, darting back and forth between the cacti and mesquite bushes. It was like a playful dog or a curious firefly leading me deeper into the darkness. Forgetting my earlier apprehension, I put the car in drive and followed it, completely mesmerized. This was better than a photograph. This was an experience. We continued like this for what felt like 10 minutes, a silent, hypnotic procession. The light would dance ahead, then wait for me to catch up, its soft glow illuminating the alien landscape of the desert floor. The initial excitement was now morphing into a profound sense of wonder, but it was tinged with something else. Something colder. The playfulness started to feel like a lure. The light wasn't just dancing, it was leading me somewhere. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. I glanced at my car's compass. I was heading southeast, deeper into the wilderness, away from any known road. The knot of unease in my stomach returned tighter this time. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. I stopped the car. "Okay, show's over," I said aloud, the sound of my own voice startling me in the immense silence. Time to go back. The orb stopped too. It hovered about 30 feet in front of my car, dead center on the road. It stopped pulsating. It just hung there in the air, silent and still. The blue-white light began to flicker like a faulty fluorescent bulb. As it flickered, the quality of the light changed. It grew dimmer, less ethereal, and more solid. As the light dimmed, I could begin to make out a shape within it. It was no longer just a sphere of energy, there was something inside. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was a figure. A tall, impossibly thin humanoid figure curled up in a fetal position inside the orb. It was a silhouette, dark and angular, all sharp elbows and knees like a desiccated insect trapped in amber. The blood drained from my face. The wonder I had felt curdled into pure, undiluted terror. This wasn't a natural phenomenon, this wasn't a mystery, this was a thing, an entity, and I had followed it like a fool into the heart of its domain. As I stared, paralyzed, the orb flickered again, more violently this time. The figure inside stirred, it began to uncurl. I saw a long, thin limb unfold, then another. It was like watching a spider unfurl its legs. It was slow, deliberate, and utterly monstrous. That's when my car died. The engine cut out. The headlights went black. The dashboard lights vanished. I was plunged into absolute total darkness. The only light left in the universe was the dim, flickering orb in front of me and the horrifying shadow thing uncoiling within it. A scream was lodged in my throat, a choked, silent thing. My hands flew to the ignition, turning the key again and again. Nothing. The engine wouldn't even turn over. Just a dead metallic click. The figure inside the orb was almost fully upright now, its long skeletal form nearly filling the sphere. It had a head, a small oblong shape, but no discernible features. It began to turn its head slowly to face me. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt it looking at me. I felt its ancient alien intelligence, cold, curious, and utterly devoid of anything I could recognize as emotion. The orb began to drift towards my car. It moved slowly, silently, gliding over the dusty road. 10 feet away. The interior of my car grew cold, a deep, penetrating cold that felt like it was leaching the heat from my very bones. My breath plumed in front of my face. 5 feet away. The orb was now right in front of my windshield. It was so close I could see the swirling dust-like particles of light that composed it. And I could see the figure inside with horrifying clarity. It was skeletal but not bone. It looked like it was made of burnt black wood or obsidian. It raised one of its long, three-jointed arms and extended a single needle-thin finger. It was going to touch the glass. I finally found my voice and screamed. It was a raw, ragged sound of pure animal terror. I threw myself sideways, away from the driver's side window, curling into a ball on the passenger seat, squeezing my eyes shut, convinced I was about to die. I was waiting for the sound of shattering glass, for the touch of that unnatural cold. Instead, there was a flash. A brilliant, blinding flash of white light that penetrated my eyelids, followed by a sound, a high-frequency vree that vibrated in my teeth. And then silence and darkness, the profound natural darkness of the desert. I lay there trembling for what felt like an eternity. I was too afraid to open my eyes. I was waiting for the next horror, but nothing came. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heart. Slowly, cautiously, I opened my eyes. The orb was gone. The figure was gone. There was nothing outside my car but the familiar star-dusted blackness of the desert night. The cold was gone too. The air in the car was warm again. With a shaking hand, I reached for the ignition key. I gave it a turn. The engine roared to life. The headlights blazed on, illuminating the empty dirt road ahead. Everything was normal, as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait to question it. I slammed the car into reverse, executed a frantic three-point turn, and floored it. I drove back the way I came, my eyes darting nervously from the road to the dark desert on either side, expecting to see that blue light reappear at any moment. I didn't slow down until my tires hit the blessed asphalt of the main road. I drove straight back to my motel in Marathon, not the campsite. I left the lights on all night. The next morning I packed up and started the long drive back to Austin 4 days early. I didn't look back. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was a hypnagogic hallucination, a waking dream brought on by fatigue and the hypnotic emptiness of the road. But I can't explain the car dying and then starting again. I can't explain the bone-deep cold, and I can't erase the image of that thing uncurling inside its cage of light. I haven't been back to Big Bend. I miss the sky, the mountains, the silence. But I can't go. That place holds a magic that is older and deeper than I ever imagined. The old man was right. The mountains have a different energy. There are real lights out there. But they aren't just lights, they're vessels, and I have no desire to find out what happens when they decide to let their passengers out. If this story chilled you, don't forget to like and comment below. Now let's continue with another terrifying tale. Story 5. The Diner That Only Served Shadows. My name is Harvey Dawson. I'm 45 and I sell agricultural equipment. My territory is West Texas, which means I spend a lot of my life on the road, driving through landscapes that most people only see in movies. It's a lot of flat earth and big sky. The towns are few and far between, and the stretches of highway connecting them can be hypnotic, especially at night. You learn to appreciate the little beacons of civilization you find along the way. The glow of a gas station, the promise of a hot meal at a 24-hour diner. They're more than just conveniences, they're anchors to reality in the vast empty darkness. This happened a few years ago, on a trip back from a farm show in Lubbock. I was heading south on US 87 making for San Angelo. It was late, probably close to 1 a.m. A storm was brewing on the horizon, one of those spectacular Texas thunderstorms, with silent flickering sheets of lightning that lit up the clouds like a giant malfunctioning flashbulb. The air was heavy and charged with electricity. I was running on fumes both in my truck and in my body. My gas light had been on for the last 20 miles and my stomach was rumbling. I'd been counting on a truck stop that I knew was just outside of La Mesa, but when I got there, the place was dark. A handwritten sign on the door said they were closed due to a power outage. My heart sank. The next town of any size was a good hour away, and I knew my truck wouldn't make it. I stood there in the flickering lightning, a real sense of dread creeping in. Being stranded in the middle of West Texas at night is no joke. I got back in my truck, my mind racing. I decided to push on, to drive as slowly and efficiently as I could, praying I'd come across something, anything. I drove for another 15 minutes, my eyes glued to the fuel gauge as the needle dipped further and further into the red. The road was utterly deserted. The lightning was closer now, and a low rumble of thunder vibrated through the cab. And then I saw it. Up ahead on the right side of the road was a light, a single flickering neon sign that read DINER, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me. It was a classic old-school diner, the kind that looks like a railroad car with big plate glass windows and a low, flat roof. It looked completely out of place, sitting there all by itself with nothing around it for miles but cotton fields and darkness. The neon sign was buzzing and flickering, some of the letters dark, so it erratically spelled DER, then DINR. I didn't care. A diner meant people, coffee, and maybe, just maybe, a gas can I could borrow or buy. I pulled my truck into the gravel parking lot. There were no other cars. I thought that was strange for a place that was open, but I figured the storm and the late hour were keeping people away. I was just grateful it was there. I walked to the door and pulled it open. A little bell chimed, a tinny, forlorn sound. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was heavy and still and completely silent. There was no clatter of plates, no sizzle from a grill, no murmur of conversation. The only sound was the incessant low-frequency buzz of the neon sign outside. The layout was exactly what you'd expect, a long counter with red vinyl stools on one side and a row of booths with cracked leather seats on the other. But the lighting was off. It was incredibly dim, coming from a few bare, low-wattage bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows. The whole place was bathed in a murky, sepia-toned gloom. And then I saw the patrons. There were about a dozen of them. A few sat at the counter, others occupied the booths. But they weren't people. They were shadows. I don't mean they were sitting in shadow. They were shadows. They were solid, three-dimensional silhouettes, blacker than the surrounding gloom. They had the shape of people. A man in a hat hunched over the counter, a woman with a beehive hairdo sitting in a booth, a family of four crammed into another, but they had no features, no faces, no clothes, no skin, just solid, featureless black shapes like holes cut out of reality. My mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I stood frozen just inside the door, my hand still on the handle. It's a trick of the light, I told myself. My eyes are tired. But I knew it wasn't true. These shapes were too solid, too defined, and they were utterly still. None of them moved. They were like statues made of darkness. A figure detached itself from the shadows behind the counter and glided towards me. It was a waitress. She had the shape of a woman in a classic diner uniform, complete with a little cap on her head. But like the others, she was a pure silhouette. Her face was a smooth black oval. There was no mouth, no nose, no eyes. Yet I felt her looking at me. "Table or counter?" a voice asked. The voice didn't come from her. It seemed to come from the air all around me, a flat, toneless, androgynous whisper. It was a voice made of static and dust. My throat was dry. I couldn't speak. I should have turned and run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out. But I was paralyzed by a mixture of terror and a bizarre, morbid curiosity. It was like being in a dream, a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The shadow waitress gestured with a black, featureless hand towards an empty booth. "Booth, then," the disembodied voice whispered. As if on autopilot, my legs carried me forward. I slid into the booth. The leather was cold and felt strangely brittle, like old paper. The shadow waitress glided over and placed a menu in front of me. It was a standard diner menu, but the text was blurry and indistinct, the words shifting and swimming before my eyes as if I were looking at them, through water. "What'll it be?" the voice whispered again, now seeming to come from right beside my ear. Just coffee," I managed to stammer, my own voice sounding alien and loud in the oppressive silence. The shadow waitress nodded, a slow, deliberate dip of her featureless head, and glided back towards the counter. I watched her go, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I risked a look at the other patrons. The man in the hat at the counter, the family in the booth, they hadn't moved. They were all frozen in their poses, but now I realized they were all oriented towards me. Every single black, featureless head was turned in my direction. They weren't looking at me, they were aimed at me. The feeling of being watched was immense, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. The air grew colder, and the low buzz from the sign outside seemed to intensify, vibrating in my teeth. The diner was not a place of refuge, it was a trap. It was a display case, and I was the new exhibit. The shadow waitress returned. She placed a cup and saucer in front of me. They were real, solid objects. But the cup was empty. There was no coffee. There was no steam, just an empty, white ceramic cup. "Enjoy," the dusty voice whispered. I stared at the empty cup, then back up at the waitress. And for the first time I felt a real, active sense of malice from her, from all of them. The curiosity was gone. replaced by a suffocating dread. This was a game, and I was the punchline. They were feeding on my confusion, my fear. I had to get out. "You know what?" I said, my voice shaking as I pushed myself out of the booth. "I just remembered. I have to be somewhere. I have to go." As I stood up, a change swept through the diner. The silence was broken by a sound. It was a low, collective hiss, like gas escaping from a dozen leaky pipes. And the shadows moved. The man at the counter turned his entire body to face me, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a poorly handled marionette. The family in the booth began to stand up, their dark forms rising in unison. Their limbs seemed to stretch, their shapes elongating, becoming taller, thinner, less human. The waitress behind the counter turned, and her smooth black face seemed to ripple, as if something inside were pushing to get out. They were all converging on me. They weren't walking, they were gliding, sliding over the floor, their dark forms closing in, blocking my path to the door. The hissing grew louder, filling the air, and it was joined by a low, guttural clicking sound. Panic gave me wings. I didn't try to go around them. I vaulted over the back of my booth, my boots slipping on the cracked leather. I landed awkwardly in the aisle on the other side and scrambled for the door. The shadows flowed over the booths and the counter like spilled ink, their hissing right behind me. I could feel a profound cold radiating from them, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absolute absence of life. I reached the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. I threw it open, the little bell chiming mockingly, and burst out into the night. The storm had broken, rain was lashing down, and a clap of thunder cracked right overhead, so loud it shook the ground. I didn't care. I ran through the blinding rain, my feet slipping in the muddy gravel of the parking lot. I didn't look back until I reached my truck. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The diner was still there, its neon sign buzzing and flickering in the downpour. But the windows were no longer dim. They were filled with darkness. The solid, featureless black of the shadows, all of them pressed up against the glass, watching me. I ripped my truck door open, threw myself inside, and jammed the key in the ignition. The engine, which had been on its last legs, miraculously turned over on the first try. I slammed the truck into drive and peeled out of the parking lot, spraying mud and gravel everywhere. I drove into the storm, my eyes locked on the road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. After a few minutes, I couldn't resist. I had to look. I glanced in my rearview mirror. There was nothing there. The diner was gone. The flickering neon sign was gone. There was only the dark, empty highway, the rain-swept cotton fields, and the receding lightning of the storm. It was as if it had never been there at all. I drove for another 10 miles before my truck finally sputtered and died, the gas tank completely empty. I sat there in the dark, the rain drumming on the roof, my body trembling uncontrollably. I was stranded, but I didn't care. I was happier to be in a dead truck in the middle of a storm than to spend one more second in that place. A state trooper found me about an hour later. I told him I'd run out of gas. I didn't tell him about the diner. How could I? He'd think I was crazy or drunk. When I got my truck refueled and running the next day, I drove back to that spot. In the clear light of day, there was nothing there. No building, no gravel parking lot. Not even a crumbling foundation. Just an empty field of red dirt next to the highway. I don't know what that place was. A hallucination? A tear in the fabric of reality? A ghost that preys on desperate, lonely travelers? All I know is that I was a customer in a diner that only served shadows, and I came dangerously close to becoming a permanent resident. Now, when I'm driving at night and I see a light in the distance, I don't feel relief anymore. I feel a prickle of fear, and I keep on driving. Story 6. The Screaming Woman Along Highway 281. My name is Melissa Hart. I'm 29 and I'm a pediatric nurse. I live and work in San Antonio, but I grew up in a small town called Blanco, right in the heart of the Texas Hill Country. It's a beautiful area, all rolling hills, live oaks, and clear rivers. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and the nights are quiet and peaceful. Or at least I used to think they were. The main artery connecting my world is US Highway 281. I've driven that road thousands of times at all hours of the day and night. It's a scenic drive, but parts of it can be unnerving after dark. It winds through dense patches of woods and over low water crossings, and there are long stretches with no streetlights, no houses, just you and the two beams of your headlights, cutting through the oppressive darkness under the thick canopy of trees. This happened about a year ago. I was driving home to my apartment in San Antonio after having dinner with my parents in Blanco. It was a Sunday night, close to midnight. I was tired after a long weekend, but the drive was second nature to me. I had my windows down, letting the humid late summer air whip through the car, and I was listening to a true crime podcast. Looking back, that last part feels like a sick cosmic joke. I was on a particularly dark and lonely stretch of 281 about halfway between Blanco and the northern edge of San Antonio. The road here is lined with thick tangled woods, mostly cedar and oak, that press right up against the shoulder. The trees are so dense they swallow the moonlight, creating a tunnel of black. That's when I heard it. Over the voices of the podcast hosts, I heard another sound. A high-pitched, desperate sound. I turned the volume down, straining to listen. It was a scream, a woman's scream. It was coming from the woods on my right side, the passenger side. It wasn't a jump-scare movie scream, it was a sound of genuine gut-wrenching terror and pain. It was the kind of scream you hear in the ER, the kind that tells you something terrible has happened. My blood ran cold. My first thought, the nurse in me taking over, was that there had been a car accident. Maybe a car had run off the road and into the trees and someone was hurt. Or worse, maybe someone was being attacked. My mind flashed through a dozen horrible scenarios. I slowed my car down, my heart pounding in my chest. I rolled up my window so I could hear better, my eyes scanning the dark tree line. The screaming came again, closer this time. A frantic, pleading wail that was abruptly cut short, as if a hand had been clapped over the person's mouth. I pulled my car over onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching loudly in the sudden silence. I put my hazard lights on, their rhythmic flashing illuminating the trees in eerie orange pulses. I grabbed my phone, my thumb hovering over the 911 button. "Hello?" I called out my window, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" For a moment there was only silence, broken by the chirping of crickets. I was starting to think I had imagined it, that it was a coyote or a bobcat. They can make some terrifying human-like sounds. I was about to put the car back in drive and call the sheriff's department just in case when I saw movement. A figure stumbled out from between two large oak trees about 50 feet ahead of me. It was a woman. She was illuminated by the pulsing glow of my hazard lights. She was wearing what looked like a simple, old-fashioned white dress, like a nightgown. It was torn and dirty. Her hair was long and dark and hung in tangled mats around her face. She was barefoot. She stood there for a second, swaying on her feet, looking dazed. Then she saw my car. She raised a hand, not to wave, but as if to shield her eyes from my lights, even though they were just blinking hazards. "Help. Me." Her voice was a choked, ragged whisper that barely carried on the night air. Relief and fear warred inside me. She was real. She was hurt. The nurse in me won. I couldn't just leave her here. "Stay right there," I shouted. "I'm calling for an ambulance." I was about to press the call button on my phone when she started to move towards me. She wasn't walking. She was stumbling, lurching forward with a strange, disjointed gait, like a deer that's been hit by a car. One of her legs seemed to drag behind her. "Ma'am, just stay put. Help is on the way," I yelled, but she kept coming, her pace quickening. As she got closer, my sense of unease skyrocketed into full-blown alarm. The closer she got, the more wrong things seemed. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost luminous in the flashing lights, like marble. Her movements were jerky and puppet-like, and her eyes, even from a distance I could see they were wide, staring and fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. She was about 20 feet from my car now. I had the driver's side door locked, but my passenger window was still cracked open a few inches. "Ma'am, please stop right there," I said, my voice shaking badly now. She didn't stop. She was almost at my passenger door, and as she stepped fully into the light of my headlights, which I'd left on, I saw her face clearly for the first time. And the world fell away. Her face was a mask of tragedy. It was pale and gaunt, but what was horrifying were her eyes and mouth. Her eyes were wide, but they were empty. They were black pits, devoid of pupils, irises, anything. Just two dark, bottomless holes in her skull. And her mouth was hanging open in a silent scream, stretched wider than humanly possible. The corners of her lips pulled back into a grotesque, impossible grimace. It was a face of pure, unending agony. I was completely frozen, my mind unable to process the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. This wasn't a woman who needed help. This was something else, something that was pretending to be a woman who needed help. She reached my passenger door. She didn't try the handle. She just leaned in close to the window, her face right next to the 2-inch gap I had left open. Her two black empty eye sockets stared directly into my car, directly at me. I could feel a palpable cold coming through the opening, a damp, grave-like chill that smelled of wet earth and something sweet, like decaying flowers. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. We were locked in this terrifying tableau, me in my car and this thing, staring in from the outside. Then she took a breath. It wasn't a normal breath. It was a loud, rattling, wet gasp, as if she were trying to suck all the air out of the night. Her skeletal chest heaved under the thin white dress, and then she screamed. It wasn't the scream I had heard from the woods. This was not a sound a human being can make. It was a sound that came from the deepest pits of hell. It was a deafening, high-frequency shriek, 1,000 times louder than the screams I'd heard before. It was a sound of pure, concentrated rage and despair, and it was aimed directly at me. The sound hit me like a physical blow. It vibrated through the car, through my seat, through my bones. My ears popped instantly, and a sharp, stabbing pain shot through my head. It was the sound of tearing metal and breaking glass and dying souls all blended into one. And then my passenger side window exploded. It didn't just crack, it shattered, blowing inwards, spraying my car and me with a million tiny cubes of safety glass. The scream, now unobstructed, poured into my car, a physical force of sound that was so loud it was just white noise, a pressure that threatened to rupture my eardrums and my sanity. The explosion of the window broke the spell. The terror finally unlocked my limbs. I let out a choked sob and stomped on the accelerator. The tires spun on the gravel for a heart-stopping second, and then they caught. The car lurched forward, shooting away from the screaming thing at my window. I didn't look in my passenger side mirror. I didn't dare. I stared straight ahead, my foot pressed to the floor, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the steering wheel. The scream followed me. It didn't fade with distance. It was just as loud, just as piercing, as if the woman were in the back seat screaming directly into my ear. I was sobbing, hysterical, my mind fracturing under the sonic assault. I drove, weaving on the road, my vision blurred by tears and the sheer pain in my head. The scream was endless, a continuous, unwavering shriek of pure malice. It went on for a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles. And then, as I passed a sign that marked the city limits of San Antonio, it just stopped. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise. It was a dead, ringing silence, the kind you get after a loud concert, but 1,000 times more profound. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that was a pale echo of the scream. I didn't slow down. I drove all the way to my apartment complex, ran a red light, and screeched into a parking spot. I stumbled out of my car and into my apartment, my body trembling, covered in tiny cuts from the shattered glass. I locked the door, bolted it, and collapsed on the floor where I lay in a shaking, weeping heap until the sun came up. The next day, I called in sick. I took my car to a repair shop. The mechanic was baffled. "What the hell hit this thing?" he asked, looking at the shattered window. "There's no point of impact. It looks like it just exploded from the inside out." I told him I thought a rock had hit it. He didn't look like he believed me. I've never driven that stretch of 281 at night again. "I'll take the long way around. I don't care how late it is." My hearing is still not right. I have a permanent case of tinnitus in my right ear. A constant faint ringing that is a perpetual reminder of that night. I'm a nurse. I'm trained to help people. My instinct is to run towards the cry for help, not away from it. But I know now that some things that cry in the night don't want to be saved. They just want you to get closer. They use your compassion as a lure, your empathy as a weapon. There's a woman on Highway 281 who screams for help, but she's not the one in danger. You are, of course. We now venture into the final, deepest pockets of darkness on this haunted journey. The stories that follow are not for the faint of heart. They are testaments to the profound and terrifying mysteries that lie waiting in the vast, empty spaces of Texas, where the road ahead can lead you to places you were never meant to go, and from which you might never truly return. Here are the final 3 stories, transcribed in the raw, detailed, and deeply personal words of those who survived them. Story 7, The Convoy That Disappeared into the Plains. My name is Robert King. I'm 54 years old, a retired history teacher. My life's passion has always been the story of America. Not the sanitized version you find in textbooks, but the real, gritty human story. After I retired, my wife and I bought a small RV, and we've been slowly making our way across the country, visiting the places I used to only teach about. I'm a student of the past, and I've always believed that if you listen closely, the land itself can tell you stories. I just never imagined I would stumble into one of those stories myself. This event took place 2 summers ago. My wife, Eleanor, had flown back east to visit our daughter for a week, leaving me to my own devices in the Texas Panhandle. I was fascinated by the area, the sheer, mind-boggling emptiness of it. It's a landscape that has swallowed people whole, from the Comanche to the Dust Bowl farmers. It's a place that feels haunted by big, powerful ghosts. I was driving the RV west on US Route 54, heading from Dalhart towards the New Mexico border. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the sun was relentless, beating down from a vast, pale blue sky. The heat coming off the asphalt created shimmering mirages in the distance, making the road ahead look like it was dissolving into a lake of mercury. The land was flat, an endless sea of parched grass and farmland stretching to a horizon so distant it felt like the edge of the world. It's a hypnotic, almost meditative kind of driving. You can go for an hour and the scenery barely changes. I was the only vehicle on the road, a tiny, solitary ship on a vast brown ocean. After about 30 minutes of this meditative solitude, I checked my rearview mirror out of habit. At first, there was nothing but the shimmering, empty road. Then a speck appeared on the horizon. It grew steadily, resolving itself into a cloud of dust, and then into a line of vehicles. A convoy. My first thought was that it was the military. We were not far from military bases, and it's not uncommon to see convoys of Humvees or transport trucks on these highways. But as they got closer, I realized these were not modern vehicles. They were old, very old. They caught up to me and settled into a steady pace behind me. There were 5 of them in total. They were U.S. Army trucks, the kind you see in World War II movies, GMC CCKW trucks, the old deuce and a halves, with canvas tops stretched over the cargo beds. They were painted in the classic olive drab, faded and weathered by time. They looked like they had just rolled out of a history book. My history teacher brain immediately lit up. I figured it had to be a club, a group of historical reenactors or military vehicle enthusiasts on their way to a show or a parade. It was a thrill to see them. These weren't pristine, museum-quality restorations. They looked used. They were caked in dust with small dents and scratches that spoke of a long and storied life. They looked authentic. I was doing about 65, a comfortable speed for the RV, and the convoy settled in behind me, maintaining a perfect uniform distance. It was impressive. I felt a sense of camaraderie with them, a shared moment on this lonely road. I gave a friendly wave out my window, but I didn't see anyone wave back. I craned my neck to look in my side mirror, trying to get a glimpse of the driver in the lead truck. I could see the silhouette of a man in the cab, wearing what looked like an old-style helmet, but his features were obscured by the glare on his windshield. We drove like that for the better part of an hour, a strange parade of the modern and the archaic, cutting a path through the timeless landscape. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the plains. The light turned golden, and the whole scene felt incredibly poignant and beautiful. Here I was, a history teacher, being escorted across the plains by ghosts of the past. It was a perfect cinematic moment. But as the miles rolled on, a few strange details began to prick at the edges of my contentment. The first thing I noticed was the sound, or rather the lack of it. I had my window open, and I should have been able to hear the roar and rumble of 5 heavy-duty truck engines from the 1940s. Those old engines were not quiet. They were loud, guttural beasts, but I heard nothing. The only sound was the wind whistling past my own mirror and the hum of my RV's tires on the asphalt. I strained my ears, even turned off my radio. Nothing. The convoy behind me was completely, utterly silent. I tried to rationalize it. The wind is in the wrong direction. My own engine is too loud. But the explanations felt thin. The silence was unnatural. It was a dead, heavy silence where there should have been a symphony of internal combustion. The second thing was the people, or again, the lack of them. The backs of the trucks were covered with canvas, so I couldn't see if they were carrying cargo or troops. But in the cabs, I could only ever make out the faintest, darkest silhouettes of drivers. They never moved. They never adjusted their position. They were as still as statues. There were no passengers visible. In a convoy of 5 trucks, you'd expect to see more signs of life, an arm resting on a window frame, a head turning to look at the scenery. There was nothing. Just the dark, still shapes locked in place. A subtle unease began to creep into my idyllic historical moment. The convoy no longer felt like a group of friendly hobbyists. It felt strange. The trucks, which had at first seemed authentically weathered, now just looked dead. The faded olive drab seemed to absorb the golden sunlight rather than reflect it. The canvas tops didn't flutter in the wind. They were unnaturally still. The sun was getting very low now, the sky turning a bruised purple and orange. The heat mirages on the road ahead were becoming more pronounced, great shimmering pools of distortion that made the asphalt seem to liquefy. The convoy was still there, locked in its perfect silent formation behind me. The feeling of camaraderie had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of being watched, of being followed by something I didn't understand. I decided I wanted to get a picture. The historian in me, the documentarian, needed to capture this bizarre, beautiful, and increasingly unsettling scene. I saw a small gravel pull-off ahead, one of those little scenic overlooks with no scenery to look at. It was the perfect opportunity. I could pull over, let the convoy pass me, and get a fantastic shot of them driving off into the sunset. I signaled and slowed down, pulling the RV onto the gravel. I came to a stop and grabbed my phone, my heart beating a little faster with a mixture of excitement and a strange, inexplicable fear. I got out of the RV. The air was still and warm. The silence was immense. I could hear the ticking of my own engine as it cooled. I turned and raised my phone, ready to capture the procession. The lead truck was just approaching my position. I looked at it directly, with my own eyes. It was exactly as I'd seen it in my mirrors. A dusty, silent, old GMC truck with a dark, still shape behind the wheel. It was real. It was solid. Then I looked through my phone's camera screen, and there was nothing there. I blinked, lowering the phone. The truck was right there, not 50 feet away, rumbling past me on the highway. I could see the tread on the tires, the rust spots on the fender, the dark silhouette of the driver. It was undeniably, physically present. I raised the phone again, my hand trembling slightly. I aimed the camera at the truck. On the screen, I saw only the empty road, the shimmering heat haze, and the setting sun on the horizon. The truck and the driver were completely invisible to the camera's lens. My blood went cold. This wasn't possible. I lowered the phone again. The truck was there. I raised it. The road was empty. It was like the convoy existed in a layer of reality that my phone's digital sensor could not perceive. The first truck passed me, then the second. I kept raising and lowering the phone, a frantic, desperate action. The result was the same every time. Real to my eyes, non-existent to the camera. The silent, ghostly trucks rolled past, one by one, each with its still, dark driver, each one a paradox that my mind couldn't resolve. The last of the 5 trucks was now approaching. I kept the phone up, staring at the empty road on my screen, even as my peripheral vision saw the solid, physical truck drawing level with me. And then it happened. The last truck reached the most intense part of the heat mirage, the spot on the road where the air was most distorted, where the asphalt seemed to turn to water. As the truck entered the shimmering haze, it began to dissolve. I don't mean it got blurry. I mean it literally began to come apart, its solid lines wavering and breaking up, its olive drab color bleeding into the oranges and purples of the sunset. It was like watching a watercolor painting being dipped in water. The truck, the canvas top, the silent driver, they all just melted into the shimmering air. And in the space of a heartbeat, the truck was gone. It didn't drive off into the distance. It simply ceased to exist. I stood there, my phone still raised, my mouth hanging open. I looked down the road. The other 4 trucks were gone too. The highway ahead of me was completely, utterly empty. There was no dust cloud on the horizon. There was no distant rumble. The silent convoy that had been my companion for the last hour had driven into a heat mirage and vanished from the face of the earth. I was alone again, in the vast, silent plains with the sun sinking below the horizon. The only evidence that anything had happened was the frantic, terrified pounding of my own heart. I got back in the RV and just sat there for a long time, watching the sky grow dark and the first stars appear. I tried to make sense of it. A mass hallucination? A trick of the light and the heat? But it had felt so real. The trucks had been so solid. The silence had been so profound. I've spent my life studying the past, teaching the stories of the men who fought in those wars, who drove those trucks. I've always seen history as something safely confined to books and museums. a collection of events that are over and done with. But on that lonely highway in the Texas Panhandle, I learned that the past is not always past. Sometimes it's still driving. There are roads in this country where the old stories are not just remembered, they are still happening. And sometimes, if the light is just right and the air is still, a history teacher on a solo road trip can find himself, for one terrifying hour, as part of a convoy of ghosts, driving silently towards a horizon that they will never reach. Story 8. The road that led me back to the same gas station. My name is Tina Alvarez. I'm 36. I work in marketing and I consider myself a supremely logical person. I believe in cause and effect, in maps, in the reliable physics of the world. I don't believe in ghosts or omens or things that go bump in the night. At least I didn't. My world was a well-ordered, predictable place until I took a wrong turn in East Texas and drove straight into a nightmare that logic couldn't explain. It was a work trip. I was driving from Houston to a conference in Shreveport, Louisiana. It's a straightforward drive, mostly on I-49, but there was a major accident reported ahead, a complete shutdown of the interstate. My GPS, ever helpful, suggested a detour. It was a series of state highways and farm-to-market roads that would snake through the piney woods of East Texas and get me back on the interstate past the blockage. It would add an hour to my trip, but it was better than sitting in a 10-mile traffic jam. So I took the exit and plunged into the backroads. At first it was pleasant. The scenery was beautiful, a dense forest of tall pine trees that created a canopy over the road. The sun was setting, filtering through the trees in long golden shafts. But as dusk settled into night, the beauty of the woods took on a more sinister quality. The trees pressed in on the road, their dark forms creating a claustrophobic tunnel. The road twisted and turned, and I quickly lost all sense of direction. I was completely reliant on my GPS. And then, of course, my phone died. I'd forgotten to plug it in, and after a full day of use, the battery gave up. The screen went black, and with it, my map, my directions, my only connection to the outside world. I was alone, on an unmarked road in the middle of a forest that felt as ancient and impenetrable as a fortress wall. A familiar low-level anxiety started to bubble up. I kept driving, hoping I'd stumble upon a major highway or a town. But every road I took seemed to lead to another identical road, a dark ribbon of asphalt cutting through an endless sea of pine trees. My fuel gauge was dipping towards empty, and the anxiety was escalating into real, palpable fear. Just as a full-blown panic was about to set in, I saw a light through the trees. It was a weak, flickering greenish-white light. As I got closer, I saw that it was a gas station. It was a small, dilapidated, independent station, the kind that looks like it hasn't been updated since the 1970s. It had a single ancient-looking pump under a rusty metal awning. The sign was a simple wooden board with the words GAS painted on it in faded red letters. The light was coming from a single long fluorescent bulb that buzzed and flickered erratically, attracting a frantic swarm of moths. It wasn't much, but it was salvation. I pulled in, my tires crunching on the gravel. The place felt off. It was unnervingly quiet. There were no other cars, no sounds from the woods, just the electric hum and crackle of the fluorescent light. The door to the small attendance building creaked open and a man stepped out. He was old, incredibly old, with skin like wrinkled parchment stretched thin over his bones. He was tall and gaunt, and he wore a pair of greasy dark green overalls. He didn't speak. He just stared at me with pale, watery eyes that seemed to hold a profound and weary emptiness. His face was a mask of apathy. There was no curiosity, no welcome, not even any hostility. Just nothing. "Hi," I said, my voice sounding overly cheerful and loud in the silence. "Can I get $20 worth, please?" The old man didn't respond. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod and turned to the ancient pump. He moved with a stiff, slow-motion gait, as if every movement was a monumental effort. He fumbled with the nozzle, his bony fingers struggling to get it into my tank. The whole process was agonizingly slow. I stood there, shifting my weight, feeling the urgent need to just get this over with and leave. The man's silent, vacant presence was deeply unsettling. After what felt like an eternity, he finished. I handed him a $20 bill. His cold, dry fingers brushed against mine, and I involuntarily flinched. His touch felt like old paper. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My phone died, and I'm completely lost. I'm trying to get to Shreveport. Can you tell me how to get to I-49 from here?" He looked at me with those pale, empty eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. I was beginning to think he was deaf or mute. Then he slowly raised a long, bony arm and pointed a single, trembling finger down the dark road I had been on. "Just keep going," he rasped. His voice was a dry, dusty whisper like the sound of leaves skittering across a grave. "Road'll take you there." "Just straight?" I asked, needing more confirmation. He just nodded again, his arm still extended, his finger pointing into the blackness. That was all I was going to get. I thanked him, got back in my car, and drove away as fast as I reasonably could. The image of his pale, vacant face burned into my mind. The sense of relief at having gas was now completely overshadowed by the desperate need to put as much distance as possible between me and that creepy old man. I followed his single instruction. I kept going straight. The road twisted and turned through the pines, but I didn't take any forks or turnoffs. I drove for what must have been 30 minutes. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of an interstate, a town, anything. But there was nothing, just the endless, monotonous tunnel of trees. And then I saw a light through the woods ahead, a familiar, flickering, greenish-white light. My heart leaped with hope. Another gas station? A small town? As I drew closer, the hope curdled into a cold, sickening dread. It was the same gas station, the same faded GAS sign, the same single ancient pump, the same buzzing, moth-swarmed fluorescent light. I slowed the car to a crawl, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. It had to be a different one, a chain. They just look alike. But it wasn't. It was the exact same one. And standing there under the flickering light as if he had never moved was the same impossibly old man in the greasy overalls. My blood turned to ice. This was impossible. I had been driving in a straight line for 30 minutes. How could I be back here? I must have gotten turned around, taken a wrong turn without realizing it. The road must be a loop. That had to be the explanation. My logical mind clung to that thought like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. I didn't stop. I didn't even look at the old man, though I could feel his empty gaze on me as I passed. I pressed my foot on the accelerator and sped past the gas station, my heart hammering against my ribs. This time I would pay more attention. I would be more careful. I found a different road, a fork that I was sure I hadn't taken before. It looked wider, more promising. I turned onto it and drove with a new sense of determination. I watched for landmarks, a strangely shaped tree, a break in the woods, anything to assure myself I was making progress. I drove for another 30 minutes, maybe 40 this time, my eyes glued to the road. And then I saw a light through the trees. "No," I whispered, "no, no, no." It was the same greenish-white flicker, the same buzz that I could now almost hear in my memory. As I came around a final bend, there it was, the same station, the same pump, the same sign. And this time the old man was not standing by the building. He was standing at the edge of the gravel lot right by the road as if he were waiting for me. His head was tilted slightly, and in the sickly light I could have sworn the edges of his thin lips were curled into the faintest, most horrifying hint of a smile. This was no longer a matter of being lost. This was not a loop in the road. This was something else. The woods were not a forest. They were a maze. The gas station was not a point on the map. It was the center of the maze. And the old man was the monster at its heart. I didn't slow down. I swerved to the opposite side of the road to give him as wide a berth as possible and floored it. As I blew past, I risked a glance in my rearview mirror. He was standing there, watching me go, his form getting smaller and smaller. Then just before the road curved and he was out of sight, he raised his long, bony arm and pointed down the road after me as if to say, "Yes, that's the way. Keep going." A wave of pure hysterical terror washed over me. I was trapped. I was a mouse in a cage, and some unseen, malevolent force was toying with me, letting me run until I was exhausted, only to find myself back at the beginning. I started to sob, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I had to do something different. The opposite. I had been trying to drive away from the station. What if I turned around? What if I drove back the way I came? I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the asphalt. I executed a frantic U-turn and started driving back in the direction of Houston, back towards my starting point. It felt counterintuitive, like I was giving up, but I was desperate. I drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 45 minutes. I didn't see the gas station again. I just drove, fueled by adrenaline and fear, until finally I saw a familiar sight. The big green reflective sign for an interstate on-ramp. I-49. The relief was so overwhelming I almost crashed the car. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the ramp and just broke down, crying with a force that shook my entire body. I had escaped. I eventually got back on the interstate and drove to the nearest well-lit, brand-name 24-hour truck stop. I sat in the bright, noisy diner for 2 hours just to be around people, to be in a place that felt real and solid. When I got to my hotel in Shreveport, I spent hours online looking at satellite maps of the area where I had been. I scoured every back road, every intersection. There is no gas station there. There is no loop. The roads are all there, but according to the maps, they are surrounded by nothing but miles and miles of dense, unbroken forest. I am a logical person. I believe in cause and effect. But I cannot find a cause for what happened to me. I was trapped in a fold of reality, a place where the laws of physics and geography no longer applied. And at the center of that place was a silent old man and his phantom gas station. He didn't chase me, he didn't threaten me, he didn't have to. All he had to do was wait. He knew the road would always lead me back. Story 9. The Pale Rider of the West Texas Desert. My name is Victor Shaw. I'm 42, an architect from Denver. I live a life of precision, of angles and load-bearing calculations, of creating order out of chaos. But every couple of years I need to break free from that. I need to feel the curve of the earth, not the straight lines of a blueprint. My escape is my motorcycle, a big, heavy Harley-Davidson Road King. For me, freedom is a full tank of gas, an empty highway, and the roar of a V-twin engine. 2 years ago, I was on the ultimate ride, a solo cross-country trip from the coast of Oregon to the Florida Keys. I was taking the southern route, and that meant crossing the vast, desolate expanse of West Texas. I was on Interstate 10, somewhere between Fort Stockton and Ozona. If you've ever been on that stretch of road, you know it's about as close to Mars as you can get on Earth. It's a stark, sun-bleached landscape of rock, dust, and scrub brush, stretching out to a horizon that shimmers under a relentless white-hot sun. It was the middle of the afternoon in late July. The heat was brutal, a physical presence that beat down on my helmet and leather jacket. The temperature had to be well over 100 degrees. The air shimmering off the asphalt was so thick it distorted the world, making the distant mesas tremble and sway. I was the only soul on the highway. The road unspooled before me, a long black ribbon laid across a canvas of beige and brown. The drone of my engine and the rush of the wind were the only sounds in the universe. It was a state of pure hypnotic motion. I had been riding for hours, and the heat and the monotony were starting to get to me. I was feeling a little lightheaded, a little disconnected. I knew I needed to find some shade and water soon. As I crested a long, low rise in the highway, I saw something in the distance. Another traveler. At first, it was just a dark, vertical shape in the shimmering haze miles ahead of me on the shoulder of the road. I assumed it was another biker, maybe someone whose bike had broken down. As I got closer, my speed eating up the distance, the shape began to resolve itself. And my brain stumbled. It wasn't a motorcycle, it was a horse, a man on a horse. I slowed down, my brow furrowed in confusion. A man on a horse on the shoulder of Interstate 10 in this blistering heat. It made no sense. There were no ranches for miles. The horse was a pale, almost luminous white, and it stood perfectly still, its head bowed against the oppressive sun. The rider was a tall, thin figure dressed entirely in black, a long, old-fashioned duster, a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, and what looked like tall riding boots. He was as still as the horse, a black silhouette against the blinding glare of the desert. My first thought was that I was hallucinating, that the heat was finally cooking my brain. But as I drew alongside them, they were undeniably real. The horse was real. It was a magnificent, powerful animal, but its coat was unnaturally white, like sun-bleached bone. Its eyes were dark and deep. The man was real. The black fabric of his duster was thick with dust, and the leather of his boots was cracked and worn. I couldn't see his face, hidden as it was in the deep shadow of his hat, but I could feel his presence. It was a heavy, cold presence that seemed to suck the heat out of the air. I slowed my bike to almost a walking pace as I passed them. I nodded, the universal biker greeting. The rider didn't respond. He didn't move a muscle. He just sat there on his pale horse, a statue of black stone facing the empty horizon. A shiver, completely unrelated to the heat, traced its way down my spine. There was something profoundly wrong about this scene. It felt ancient, archetypal, like a page torn from a book of grim folklore and dropped onto the modern asphalt. I twisted the throttle and sped up, wanting to put some distance between me and the unsettling tableau. I glanced in my mirror. The man and his horse were still there, unmoving, shrinking in the distance. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Just a local eccentric, I told myself. A rancher taking a shortcut. The explanation was flimsy, but it was all I had. I drove on, pushing my bike up to 80, then 90, the engine roaring in protest. The image of the silent rider was seared into my mind. After about 5 minutes of hard riding, I checked my mirror again, expecting the figure to be gone, swallowed by the distance and the haze. He was there, and he was closer. He was no longer on the shoulder. He was on the highway itself, in my lane behind me, and he was keeping pace. My heart skipped a beat. A horse. A horse was keeping pace with a Harley-Davidson doing 90 miles an hour. It was impossible. It was insane. I stared into the small, vibrating mirror, my mind reeling. The horse wasn't galloping, it wasn't even running. It seemed to glide, its hooves not quite touching the asphalt, moving with an effortless, terrifying grace. The rider was still perfectly erect, perfectly still, a black monolith on the back of a spectral steed. Panic began to bubble in my throat. This wasn't a rancher. This wasn't an eccentric. This was something else entirely. The sun, which had been a blazing white ball, seemed to dim, the light taking on a sickly gray quality. The air grew cold, the blistering heat replaced by a sudden unnatural chill that cut through my leather jacket and made my teeth chatter. I pushed the throttle as far as it would go. The speedometer needle crept past 100. The engine screamed. The wind tore at me. But he was still there. He was gaining on me. He pulled up alongside me in the other lane, as if I were standing still. I risked a glance to my left, and I saw him. He was no more than 10 feet away. The pale horse glided beside me, its breath pluming in the cold air. Breath that shouldn't be visible in this heat. Its eyes were not the eyes of an animal. They were black, intelligent, and filled with an ancient coldness. And the rider, he turned his head slowly to look at me. The hat still cast his face in deep shadow, but I could see enough. His skin was the color of old parchment stretched tight over a skull. His lips were thin and bloodless, pulled back in a semblance of a smile that held no humor, only a grim and final knowledge. And in the depths of the shadow I saw the glint of his eyes. They were not eyes. They were pinpricks of cold white light like distant dying stars. I was looking at death, not a symbol of it, not a metaphor for it. I was riding alongside the pale rider himself on a lonely stretch of Texas highway. A wave of profound, soul-crushing dread washed over me. It was a feeling beyond mere fear. It was a sense of utter finality, a calm, cold certainty that my journey was over. My life, with all its plans and projects, its loves and its losses, felt like a distant, insignificant memory. All that was real was this moment, this silent, gliding figure beside me, and the immense cold weight of his gaze. I felt my grip on the handlebars slacken. My will to fight, to flee, was draining away, replaced by a strange, weary acceptance. It was so easy to just give up, to let go, to swerve and embrace the inevitable. The rider raised a hand. He was wearing a black leather glove, and he pointed a single long finger at me. He didn't speak, but a voice echoed in my mind, a voice that was not a sound but a feeling, a thought that was not my own. It was a voice of dust and ages, and it said simply, "Your time has come." And in that moment something in me broke. Some primal animal instinct for survival roared to life, drowning out the cold acceptance. It was a furious, desperate no that screamed through every cell of my being. I was not ready. I would not go. I did the only thing I could think of. I swerved. I swerved my bike directly at him. It was a suicidal, insane move, but it was a move of defiance. I was going to go down fighting. I was going to meet this thing head on. As my front wheel crossed the line into his lane, the rider and his horse did not flinch. They didn't move to avoid me. They simply faded. They became translucent, like smoke, for a fraction of a second. My bike passed right through the space they had occupied. I felt a shock of absolute soul-deep cold, a cold so intense it felt like it was freezing my heart in my chest. And then I was through them. I wobbled, fighting to control the bike, my body shaking uncontrollably. I looked in my mirror. The rider was behind me again, solid and real, gliding down the highway. But he was no longer pursuing me. He had stopped. He sat on his pale horse in the middle of the interstate, a stationary figure watching me go. I didn't slow down. I drove with a terror-fueled desperation I have never known before or since. I drove until my engine sputtered and died, the fuel tank finally empty. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder, my bike silent for the first time in hours. I was miles away from where I had seen him. I sat there gasping for air, my body drenched in a sweat that was now freezing in the unnatural chill that still clung to me. I looked back down the long, empty road. He was gone. The sun was bright again, the heat was returning, the world was slowly coming back into focus. I was eventually picked up by a highway patrolman who gave me enough gas to get to the next town. I told him I'd miscalculated my fuel. I didn't tell him that I had been racing death across the desert. I sold my motorcycle when I got back to Denver. I haven't been on one since. The feeling of freedom I once associated with the open road is gone, replaced by the memory of that cold, silent presence. I am an architect. I build things that are meant to last, to defy time. But I learned something out there, in the sun-bleached emptiness of West Texas. There are some things that time cannot touch. There are forces as old as the earth itself, and they still ride the lonely roads. And if you're unlucky enough to cross their path, you learn that the straight, predictable lines of our lives are far more fragile than we could ever imagine. I looked into the face of finality, and it looked back at me. And I know, with every fiber of my being, that one day I will see that pale rider again. But next time, I don't think I'll be able to swerve. Thanks for watching.